The Once and Future Present, Episode 11, New Worlds, Old Ambitions from Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Once and Future Present, the podcast that helps us explore the past to better understand the world we live in today. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today we're setting sail, literally and figuratively, into one of the biggest turning points in world history, the Age of Exploration. This is the episode where we ask the big questions. How did Europe go from being a bunch of fragmented kingdoms on the edge of the known world to global empire builders? Why did they start sailing across oceans? And what happened when they did? And of course, I'm not making this journey alone. I've got two trusty navigators with me, Professor Theo.
It's good to be back, Casey. And you're right, this is a big one. When we talk about European exploration, we're not just talking about daring sailors or maps with sea monsters. We're talking about the beginning of global systems, colonialism, capitalism, and race, that still shape our lives today.
And Dr. Morgan.
That's right. Exploration wasn't just about discovery. It was also about conquest, control, and competition. But it was never inevitable. And that's where we'll really dig in, using the 5 C's of historical thinking to understand what changed, what stayed the same, and how different choices could have led to different outcomes.
Let's start at the beginning, not with Columbus, but with the bigger picture. What was the world like before Europe started sailing west?
That's such an important place to start. We tend to think of history beginning with European movement, but long before Europeans set out across the Atlantic, the world was already deeply interconnected. The Afro-Eurasian trade world was thriving. This included vast overland routes like the Silk Road. But even more importantly, by the 15th century, a web of maritime trade routes connected the Indian Ocean world, from East Africa to the Middle East, to India, Southeast Asia, and China.
In fact, if you had to pick a center of global trade in the year 1400, you wouldn't pick Europe. You'd probably pick China or the Indian Ocean. In China, the Ming Dynasty had a booming economy, massive cities, and advanced technology. They even launched enormous naval expeditions under Admiral Zheng He in the early 1400s, ships so large that European caravels would have looked like lifeboats next to them.
And in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was rising fast. They controlled the key land routes between Europe and Asia, and they became the gatekeepers of spice and silk trade. Meanwhile, African empires like Mali and Songhai were dominating trans-Saharan trade, exporting gold, salt, and enslaved people.
So Europe was kind of left out?
In many ways, yes. European kingdoms like Spain, Portugal, and even the Italian city-states were on the periphery of these massive, well-established networks. They wanted the goods, especially spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, but they didn't control the routes. Everything they got came at a markup through Muslim and Venetian middlemen.
Okay, so Europe was hungry for access, but not really in control yet. So what changed?
That's where we start thinking about causation. What caused the change wasn't one single thing. It was a combination of political shifts, religious motivations, economic ambitions, and new technologies. Spain and Portugal had just finished centuries of religious war on the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista, which ended in 1492 with the fall of Granada. That gave them momentum, national pride, and a sense of divine mission.
And at the same time, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 made land routes east more dangerous and expensive for Europeans. So, the idea of reaching Asia by sea became more attractive and more urgent.
So Europe didn't suddenly become more powerful, they got more desperate?
That's a fair way to put it. They were motivated by what we now call the 3 Gs: God, gold, and glory. Religious zeal to spread Christianity and fight Islam. Economic drive to access trade goods and precious metals, and the personal ambition of explorers and monarchs who wanted fame, fortune, and titles.
And don't forget competition. By the late 1400s, Europe was developing into a world of rival nation-states. Spain didn't want Portugal to get ahead. France and England were watching closely. Everyone wanted to be the first to claim the riches of the East and anything else they found along the way.
So, now that we've set the stage, let's talk about how these voyages actually began. What were the first major steps?
The first country to really push into ocean exploration was Portugal. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors began venturing down the west coast of Africa as early as the 1420s. They weren't just exploring, they were establishing trading posts and gathering knowledge of the currents and winds.
Prince Henry was called the Navigator, not because he was a sailor himself, but because he sponsored voyages and built a school for navigation. He brought together mapmakers, shipbuilders, and sailors to share knowledge. This institutional investment made Portugal a leader in exploration for decades.
And what were they looking for? Spices?
Spices, yes, but also gold and enslaved people. Portuguese ships traded for gold in West Africa and started transporting enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations on Atlantic islands like Madeira and São Tomé. This was a chilling preview of the plantation slavery that would later dominate the Americas.
One of the technological advantages Portugal had was the caravel, a light, fast ship that could sail against the wind using its triangular lateen sails. It could also handle the rougher waters of the Atlantic, which made longer journeys possible.
Did they reach India?
They did. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama made it all the way to Calicut, India, where he traded for spices and returned with a cargo worth 60 times the cost of the voyage. That success transformed Portugal into a global maritime power.
That sounds huge. How did Spain respond?
Spain, newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, was eager to compete. They had just conquered Granada in 1492, ending the Reconquista, and they wanted to project their new power. That same year, they funded Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor who believed he could reach Asia by sailing west.
Columbus vastly underestimated the size of the Earth, partly because he relied on flawed calculations based on Ptolemy's geography, which had resurfaced in Europe thanks to Islamic scholars. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas, he thought he'd found islands near Japan.
But it wasn't Asia.
Nope. It was a whole new continent Europeans hadn't known existed. But Columbus didn't realize that. He made 4 voyages, always insisting he'd reached Asia. Meanwhile, his encounters with the Taino people turned violent quickly. He established colonies, enslaved indigenous people, and set the tone for what would become the Spanish conquest of the Americas.
The Spanish crown quickly realized what was at stake and began organizing colonization efforts. But Portugal protested. To avoid war, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing the world between them with a line drawn down the Atlantic. Portugal got Brazil and Africa, Spain got the rest of the Americas.
They just split the world?
Yes, and that tells us a lot about the European mindset at the time, a mix of arrogance, entitlement, and religious justification. It didn't matter that there were millions of people already living in these lands. Europeans believed they had the right to claim and rule based on exploration and a papal blessing.
So, this was more than exploration. It was about empire?
Absolutely. From the very beginning, these voyages were about claiming land, seizing wealth, and expanding political and religious power. They set in motion centuries of conquest, colonization, and resistance, all of which we'll explore more deeply as we continue.
Okay, so once Spain claimed these new lands, how did they go about taking control of them? I know we're supposed to talk about the Aztec and Inca empires, but I honestly don't know much about them.
Let's start with the Aztecs. Their empire was based in what is now central Mexico, and their capital city was Tenochtitlan, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Built on an island in the middle of a lake, it had canals, temples, marketplaces, and a population that may have reached 200,000. It was incredibly advanced.
They had a complex society built on a system of tribute from conquered peoples. That means the Aztecs didn't just control their empire through force. They demanded payment in goods, crops, and even sacrificial victims. Religion was central, and human sacrifice was believed to be necessary to keep the cosmos in balance.
That's intense. So how did the Spanish defeat such a powerful empire?
In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived with a few hundred Spanish soldiers and a huge dose of ambition. He made alliances with indigenous groups who had been oppressed by the Aztecs, especially the Tlaxcalans, who provided thousands of warriors.
When Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan, he was initially welcomed by Moctezuma II, who may have thought the Spanish were divine, or at least politically useful. But tensions rose quickly. Eventually, the Spanish kidnapped Moctezuma, violence erupted, and the city descended into chaos.
One of the biggest turning points was smallpox. It spread rapidly through the city and killed a huge portion of the population. It weakened the Aztecs, both physically and psychologically.
Wait, you just mentioned smallpox. Can I ask about that? Like, how big a role did disease actually play?
It was massive. Smallpox is a highly contagious virus that causes fever, vomiting, and a painful rash that turns into pus-filled sores. It spreads through the air or direct contact and can be deadly, especially to populations with no prior exposure. When it arrived in the Americas, the Aztecs had no immunity at all.
Some reports suggest that within a year of contact, as much as half the population of Tenochtitlan had died. Imagine the panic. Priests, soldiers, farmers, children, all dying in huge numbers while trying to defend their city.
So it wasn't just weapons or tactics. It was also germs.
Exactly. Germs, alliances, and timing. It's one of the clearest examples of contingency. If smallpox hadn't struck when it did, the outcome of the conquest might have looked very different.
Exactly. The conquest wasn't guaranteed. The Spanish benefited from divisions within the Aztec Empire, miscommunication, and epidemics.
The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked the beginning of Spanish rule in Mexico, but it wasn't the end of resistance. Indigenous peoples continued to fight, flee, or adapt for generations.
What about the Incas?
The Inca Empire was in South America, with its capital in Cuzco. It stretched across the Andes Mountains and included parts of modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. They had a centralized bureaucracy, a road system over 14,000 miles long, and a method of record-keeping using quipus, knotted strings.
In 1532, Francisco Pizarro met the Inca Emperor Atahualpa just after he had won a civil war against his brother. Pizarro lured him into a meeting, captured him, and demanded a massive ransom, rooms filled with gold and silver.
Did they release him after they got the treasure?
No. Even after the ransom was paid, Pizarro had Atahualpa executed. Then the Spanish marched on Cusco and began dismantling the empire. Like in Mexico, disease and internal conflict helped the Spanish conquer a territory that would have been impossible for them to defeat otherwise.
It's important to remember that both the Aztec and Inca empires were incredibly sophisticated. The idea that European conquest was inevitable or justified because of civilization is false. What happened was violent, tragic, and shaped by circumstances, not destiny.
It sounds like these events were messy, unpredictable, and full of consequences. So, after the conquests, what did Spain actually do with these new territories?
After conquest came colonization. Spain didn't just want to control land. They wanted to build an empire that would funnel wealth back to Europe. So they developed a colonial system to govern, extract, and convert.
What do you mean by convert?
Religious conversion. The Catholic Church played a huge role. Missionaries came to spread Christianity, build churches, and baptize indigenous people. It was framed as a spiritual mission, but it also supported colonial control. If you change someone's religion, you often tried to change their culture too.
Administratively, Spain divided its American empire into viceroyalties. These were large regions ruled by a viceroy, who acted as the king's representative. The two major ones at first were the Viceroyalty of New Spain, centered in Mexico, and the Viceroyalty of Peru, centered in Lima.
So the viceroys were kind of like colonial governors?
Exactly. They oversaw local officials, collected taxes, and tried to enforce Spanish law. But given the size of the territories and the distance from Spain, local abuses were common.
And one of the most significant systems of abuse was the encomienda system. Under this system, the Spanish crown granted colonists the right to demand labor from indigenous communities. In theory, the Spanish were supposed to provide food, shelter, and Christian instruction in return.
But I'm guessing that didn't happen.
Not usually. In practice, encomienda was often just a way to extract labor and wealth. It resembled slavery in many ways, even though it was legally framed as protection and education. Encomenderos, that's what the landowners were called, worked people to death in mines, on plantations, and in construction projects.
One voice who spoke out was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who initially benefited from the system, but later became its critic. He wrote graphic accounts of cruelty, arguing that indigenous people had souls and should not be enslaved. His work helped lead to some reforms, but the core systems of forced labor remained.
So what happened when the indigenous population started to collapse?
That's when Spain, and later Portugal, England, and others, turned more heavily to African slavery. As millions of indigenous people died from disease, overwork, and violence, Europeans began importing enslaved Africans to fill the labor gap, especially in sugar plantations.
This was part of the broader system known as the transatlantic slave trade. It connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a triangle of trade. European goods for African slaves, slaves for American sugar and silver, and raw goods back to Europe.
So exploration wasn't just about finding things. It was about building systems of control.
Exactly. And these systems became institutionalized. Spanish colonists created bureaucracies, passed laws, and shaped economies around inequality, forced labor, and racial hierarchy.
And they weren't just exploiting labor. They were transforming entire environments and societies. Which brings us to our next topic, the Columbian Exchange.
So what exactly was the Columbian Exchange?
It was the massive transfer of plants, animals, people, and diseases between the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, the Americas, that began after Columbus's voyages. It reshaped diets, economies, environments, and populations on every continent it touched.
Let's start with food. From the Americas, Europeans got potatoes, maize, corn, tomatoes, cacao, peanuts, and tobacco. These crops became staples in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Potatoes especially had a huge impact on European diets and population growth.
And what went the other direction?
From Europe, the Americas received wheat, rice, sugarcane, horses, pigs, cows, and more, along with deadly diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. These diseases had a devastating effect on indigenous communities that had no prior exposure or immunity.
Some scholars estimate that between 50 and 90% of indigenous populations died within a century of first contact. Entire villages were wiped out. This demographic collapse made it easier for Europeans to conquer and colonize, but it also had a deep human and cultural cost.
That's heartbreaking. Did the Columbian Exchange affect Africa too?
It did. African populations began growing because of the introduction of New World crops like cassava and maize. But it also became a central node in the growing system of Atlantic slavery. As European demand for sugar and silver increased, so did their demand for enslaved labor, and Africa paid the price.
And here's where we start to see something new and dangerous emerging: a racial caste system. Spanish colonists began categorizing people by ancestry. Peninsulares were Spaniards born in Spain. Creoles were of Spanish descent, but born in the Americas. Then came mestizos, mixed indigenous and European, mulattoes, mixed African and European, and so on.
That sounds like a rigid social ladder.
It was. The casta system wasn't just social, it was legal. It affected your taxes, your ability to hold office, who you could marry, even how you dressed. Your purity of blood could determine your entire life.
And it connects to ideas we've talked about before, like the Statute of Kilkenny in medieval Ireland, which tried to separate the English from the Irish through laws. But in the Americas, race was codified in ways that became a model for later colonial systems, including slavery in the British colonies and segregation in the U.S.
So even though the people and the continents changed, the idea of controlling others through categories stayed the same?
Yes, that's a great example of continuity, even amid all this dramatic change.
Okay, let's do a quick check-in with the 5 C's of historical thinking to wrap this up. Causation. What caused European exploration?
Religious zeal, economic ambition, political rivalry, and technological innovation, all woven together.
Change over time.
The Columbian Exchange changed global diets, environments, and populations. Labor systems shifted from indigenous exploitation to transatlantic slavery.
Continuity.
European hierarchies of power, religious justification for conquest, and ideas about racial difference were adapted but preserved.
Contingency.
Everything could have turned out differently. Without smallpox, without internal indigenous divisions, without Columbus getting lucky with wind patterns, history didn't have to unfold this way.
Complexity.
Exploration wasn't just heroic or evil, it was both. It brought global connection and catastrophic loss. It created new opportunities and reinforced old inequalities.
Wow. This episode has really changed the way I think about discovery. It's not just a story of brave explorers. It's a story of power, suffering, survival, and transformation.
That's the heart of historical thinking. Asking better questions and listening to the people whose voices were silenced in the official versions.
And remembering that the past isn't just behind us, it's still shaping our present.
Thanks so much, both of you. And to our listeners, we'll see you next time when we cross over into the world of the Reformation. Remember, stay curious, think critically,